Welcome to the program. Today we turn our focus to a historic milestone, South Africa's successful hosting of the G20 Summit, the first to be held on African soil. It is no small feat, organizing more than 130 meetings, including task force sessions, ministerial roundtables, and the Leaders' Summit itself. Analysts say South Africa proved that the continent is ready to take up global leadership roles, from climate finance to development reform, trade to digital inclusion. This presidency showcased the capacity and ambition of African diplomacy. But behind the handshakes and historic group photos in Johannesburg, deeper questions remain. U.S. President Donald Trump boycotted the summit and lobbied hard to prevent a unified communiqué. 19 countries refused to be bullied, and they signed a 30-page final declaration. There are skepticism, though, that it lacks real bite. The questions need to be asked. How much power does such a declaration actually carry? Was the face-off with the U.S. a diplomatic triumph or just optics? And what does this moment mean for Africa's global standing going forward? To share perspective on South Africa's presidency of the G20 and what really was achieved, Alex Vines is the Program Director, Africa-European Council on Foreign Relations. He joins us from London. And Liesl Louw-Vaudran is a Senior Advisor, African Union. She joins us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you both for being here today. Let me start with you, Alex. Despite the weaknesses, many are calling South Africa's G20 year a diplomatic success. Do you agree?
Look, the G20 is on African soil, presided by an African country. That's a success. And of course, it's a double success because it's the first time that the African Union, which is a full member of the G20, is also participating. So in those terms, of global inequality being gradually readdressed, I think it was a success. And some of the work that South Africa commissioned as its presidency, the G20, has been important and influential, be it on debt, be it on inequality. Obviously, the shame of the summit itself was that it was overshadowed by the Ukraine crisis and also particularly by the absence of President Trump and an American delegation. But I'm sure we're going to discuss that later.
Yes. Liesl, in what ways? I mean, African Union, I don't know, do we call them the G21 as G21 now or still G20? But talk to us in what way South Africa's presidency is a success.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Perhaps I should just clarify I work for the International Crisis Group on the African Union. I'm the senior advisor. So yes, as Alex Vines also mentioned, the African Union in 2023 did become, a full member. So it's actually the G20 21 because the European Union is its 20th member. But nevertheless, this summit was extremely important, as you noted, the first time on the African on the African continent, but also the fact that in such a fraught environment and with the US absence, that the countries that were there were able to create a consensus on various issues. I think we can look at, first of all, the fact that they did achieve declaration on Saturday. It was even before the end of the actual Leaders' Summit. That in itself was an achievement, and we can perhaps discuss, what that 30-page document actually contains. But the fact is that the 20 remaining G20 members in the room managed to come up with a consensus. Argentina, which right from the start we knew would have problems with some of the language and did raise objections, because we know Argentina is quite close to Donald Trump, the Argentinian president, and so on, did object, but did agree at the Sherpa meeting, which was now the meeting of the different government representatives who led this one long year process in Johannesburg on early, actually Friday morning, did agree. So Argentina, despite having certain reservations, did agree. And so that in itself, was an achievement. I think the other achievement is also getting certain things on the agenda, pushing certain issues that were definitely unpopular in the US. I mean, even in the UN, it's difficult to speak about climate change, gender equality, and issues like that. And as I said, we can maybe look at more of the details. So getting certain things on the agenda, the African engagement frameworks and those mechanisms already, I think, is an achievement given how difficult this moment is in geopolitics.
Indeed, Alex, we will try and talk a bit more about the U.S. boycotting, but aside that, we know there were lots of politics and maneuvering involved in trying to, it's not easy, 19 countries. What, in your view, did South Africa manage well that ensured that the summit wasn't derailed entirely?
Well, the discussion on debt, I think, was really important, and that's been re-echoed in the EU-AU summit that's taking place right at this moment in Luanda, Angola. So that's a success. The raising of global conflicts and the importance of mediating in them. So there was conversation not just about Ukraine, but also focus on Gaza. And then African conflicts. The worst conflict in the world probably is Sudan at the moment. That was mentioned in the final communiqué, but also the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that was also an issue that I think we have to welcome, that it wasn't over-focused just on Ukraine. And then obviously about global governance reform, that was on the agenda too. So the G20's mandate has greatly widened over the years, and it's not just about economics, it's also about politics, and I think that was reflected. And okay, Mr. Trump boycotted and the Americans boycotted the summit. The president didn't come, but an Argentinian delegation was at the summit, and so there was quite a lot. There was participation globally, except for the United States, and I think that was a success too.
The rallying of different countries, the stance of Ramaphosa that they will not be bullied. Some people say all of this sort of strengthened the solidarity that we saw, the Ramaphosa's stance. What's your thinking on that? I'm staying with you, Alex.
Yeah, look, I do think there was a bit of danger for South Africa in poking the bear, if that's how we describe it, Mr. Trump. And so the dispute over the final ceremony and whether the South Africans would accept the chargé d'affaires and a diplomatic delegation out of Pretoria to receive the presidency of the G20 for next year, which South Africa said no to. We will see if that now plays out with the Americans saying, well, we're not going to give visas for South Africans to attend the G20 summit. Bear in mind that that Mr. Trump has already said that he doesn't believe that South Africa should be a member of the G20. And so there could be economic and other political implications for South Africa for having stood up, and President Ramaphosa saying, I'm not going to be bullied. We're going to have an empty chair at the end of the summit. We're not going to have junior diplomats receiving the baton, so to speak, between the South African presidency and the presidency of the United States. It's very difficult to predict where the Trump administration will go in this, but my reading is that there is ideology here, and next year is going to be a difficult year for South Africa.
Interesting. 120-page paragraph, that's what the size of the declaration by the leaders. And I mean, so far they've been saying it's a bit weak. In what ways would you say the declaration is weak, or it's just mere skepticism by those who might not want it to work? Liesl?
Yes, I mean, we must keep in mind that the G20 is an informal body. It doesn't have a permanent secretariat. It's a group that came together essentially, I mean, at a heads of state level after the 2008 economic crisis. So it doesn't have any binding power, but it has been very important in stabilizing economic policy, in drawing up various frameworks that then can be taken forward by international financial institutions, and also increasingly getting involved in politics and creating consensus. I mean, it's as I said earlier, it's very difficult to do in this fraught environment. And we must remember, these are governments that are now having to agree on all these issues. I mean, I remember attending in December 2024 a meeting ahead of South Africa. Well, it must have been November, ahead of South Africa's chairship of the G20. And the discussion was around what can we realistically achieve during this year. And there was a lot of skepticism even then from experts who said, look, the G20, if you can put something on the agenda, that's already great. If you can put it in the final declaration, create some structures, create frameworks. I think South Africa then was from the start very keen on pushing African priorities, and in a way also to not to get around the G20, but to highlight some of the issues even more. For example, it created this Africa expert panel with eminent persons and experts led by a former South African finance minister that came up with a report with recommendation. Now, not all those recommendations found their way into the final leaders' declaration, but there's an African engagement framework, that has been set up, and that will hopefully carry it forward. As Alex once said, I mean, next year is going to be a difficult year, but then the UK will take over in 2026 if the G20 can survive in its current form. And also depending what happens in the UK before 2026. But hopefully these things can continue and feed into other processes, the UN General Assembly, for example. I mean, unfortunately, diplomacy is very slow, but if we look at where we were 10 years ago, in terms of Africa and Africa's priorities, issues like debt, disaster risk, critical minerals, which is obviously a huge topic at the moment, you can see that there's a slight shifting globally in all these forums where African agency, Africa's voice is increasingly being heard, and issues are being prioritized. But as I said, even in South Africa, there was the realization right from the start that this is an informal grouping that can't impose its decisions. Its decisions aren't binding, but they are very, very influential because you have, 85% of the world's GDP around the table. Okay. Now, this wasn't part, but I mean, it is a very important forum, I would say.
Okay. You've raised, both of you have raised a couple of issues. There's one very important one on ways that it will be a difficult year for South Africa. We'll come to that a little later so we can stay on theme for a little longer. talking about that, poking the bear, you say, Alex, that South Africa did, they took a bit of a risk. So I want us to explore that line of thought a little. How might Trump's boycott and behind-the-scenes lobbying have influenced the tone and language of the communique that we now have? While he's answering that, Liesl, you might want to think about other ways. I know you've spoken a bit about it, but other ways we can strengthen this declaration. I mean, in ways that will not make the whole exercise just an academic exercise. Alex, you, please.
Yeah, so the communique being issued had consensus throughout the G20, the European countries, the UK, France, Germany, Italy. They all supported that there needed to be a communique. So, President Trump was trying for there not to be a communique. And in fact, I think the learning comes from under Trump 1 that under Trump 1 G20s also, he didn't like the multilateralism and the G20 summits, and he was worked around and nobody suffered from that. So I think that's a good sign of international solidarity for South Africa and for the G20 process. As I said, in terms of poking the bear, I do think the final choreography relating to handing over the baton between South Africa and the United States has probably provoked and worsened bilateral relations that were already in a frozen state between the United States and South Africa. And I think South Africa may have to pay for this next year when the G20 presidency is taken over by the United States and the summit is hosted in Florida. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm worried about that. Now, obviously, there is another summit process taking place, which is smaller, which is the G7. France is taking over the presidency of the G7, and there will be a strong Africa theme within that. Paris is planning to use the France-Africa summit that takes place in May next year in Nairobi as a sounding board to bring in African issues into the G7 presidency thinking and into their communique. So I don't think Trump will be interested in the global south in the G20 summit next year, but I think the French version of the G7 will ensure that some of the issues that were discussed in Johannesburg at the G20 summit this year under the South African presidency will continue to be discussed in international fora next year.
So the chances are there that most of the declaration will be on hold. And that's the impression I'm getting. But on the optimistic side, these countries came and represented at the summit. Back to you, Liesl. Can we move this declaration from being symbolic to being more binding? In what ways can we strengthen it?
Yes, in various ways, I think. I mean, fortunately, there are many civil society organizations. There was a T20, for example, Think Tank 20, where think tanks were very much involved in the process. They are following it up and keeping tabs on implementation of these commitments. So you will see at least from the South African think tanks and others, a kind of a periodic review of have these things been implemented, because I agree with you, a whole year of meetings, I mean, astronomical amounts of money and time and so on went into 22 working groups, 130 meetings. So what, if it's only the value of dialogue already, I agree. I mean, it's important. And it's been great for South Africa's, image and hospitality industry and so on. But there are certain commitments in there that the governments have agreed to. And even not only in South Africa, but countries like, European countries, Canada, Australia, and so on, that have committed to certain things. Even, as I say, critical minerals framework. Now, especially countries like Canada and Australia have got huge mining companies, and it's quite controversial that actually found itself, into the final statement. So these common frameworks, for example, there was a suggestion in the document that there should be a borrowers club, because we all know about the creditors club, the Paris club, and so on, that dictates and in many ways dictates how poor countries, least developed countries, should run their economies. But the sense was to say, strengthen the hand of borrowing countries, because that is that, and we know that many African countries have got weak civil service, weak structures, and so if they can work together to be stronger and use these frameworks, that could also, as I said, move the needle on some of these things. One thing that I have to say about the African Union, which is 55 member countries, if the African Union can also in future use its voice in future G20 meetings, that could also be beneficial for the continent and for the global south. But for now, the African Union wasn't as visible as people would have liked it to be, also because of lack of consensus amongst African countries. So the African Union Commission sitting there at the G20 didn't have enough common African positions. So it has some, but it couldn't speak on behalf of the continent, also because of the nature of the African Union. So that's one thing we can work on going forward. But as I said, if you look at the 30 pages and all the various commitments that have been made, civil society organizations in those countries can say, right, you have committed to this common framework on debt.
Put the pressure on, so to speak.
Sorry?
No, so put the pressure on, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, Alex, I want you to share that concern with us, because we're going to be we'll still go back to looking at the gains of this summit, but I want to explore those concerns you've raised and how it might impact, the declaration and efforts to push Africa more into the global scene. In what ways do you think South Africa is likely to pay in the coming year when U.S. Takes charge?
Well, I think South Africa is going to have to work out, the art of the deal with the United States. What is it that might attract the Trump administration with South Africa? So already this year has been one of wrestling between Pretoria and Washington. One of the offers that Pretoria has made is a strategic arrangement with critical and strategic minerals. So the United States is in overdrive looking at accessing minerals. And Liesl's mentioned this. That was an important part of the G20 Summit. And so I think there is room for understanding between South Africa and the United States that is looking to secure minerals for its supply chains and for its industrial complexes. South Africa has also been looking at maybe importing a lot more US originated energy, particularly gas, and to show that actually the United States would benefit, including through its exports with South Africa. So we'll see how these kind of commercial carrots, whether they will be taken by Washington in any way. But my worry is that it does seem very ideological in Washington. There were already signs of the difficulties of dealing with a Trump administration under the first Trump administration, and it's gone on steroids in this second term. I never imagined it to have deteriorated as quickly as it did. I myself had warned a South African consultation this time last year of what they might expect from a Trump administration, but I thought it could be managed, and it's a lot more difficult than I or many observers had anticipated. But I still think there is room for maneuver, particularly on things that the United States really cares about.
Declaration. I wanted to ask you, but it skipped my mind, so I'm going to ask you now. How do you think we can strengthen it from being symbolic to being more productive for Africa, maybe in addition to what Liesl has said?
Well, I mean, there are different fora that are developing and people are moving around. So, yeah, I mean, South Africa is a member of the BRICS. Nigeria has an interest in the BRICS too. I'm not ideological. I think countries need to decide what works for them. Even second tier multilateral fora, the language-based ones are growing. So Togo and Gabon have joined the Commonwealth. Ghana joined La Francophonie last year. So you're seeing kind of growth in a variety of different fora at the moment, which I think is these are indicators of the fractured international system, and people are moving, countries are moving around and pick and choosing. We are in an era of a la carte foreign policy in that way. Nigeria is looking at what its choices and options are in this regard also. So I'm not alarmed by this, but I do think that the flavor of the G20 will be very particular next year. Bear in mind that the fundamental point of US foreign policy under Trump is he does not believe in multilateralism. So it's going to be very transactional and very much paying to the United States Make America Great Again movement base. And so that's very different from what we saw out of the South African presidency or the Brazil presidency or the Indian presidency of the G20 the last 3 years. The cycle is now going to be focused over the next couple of years for G20. As Liesl mentioned, it's the United States next year, but it's the United Kingdom the year after.
When we come back, I'm going to see how we can, because we've talked a lot about South Africa and the US, but we've not talked about other African involvement in the entire process, and of course the African Union. Take a break, we'll be right back. Do stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. Liesl, let me just ask the question, how involved were African countries? Did other African countries engage meaningfully in the entire process of South Africa's presidency and the summit, or was it largely a South African affair?
Yes, I mean, there was, I think, in all the working groups and in the process throughout the year, quite a bit of African involvement. I mean, so Angola, as the chair of the African Union for 2025, played a key role. The President João Lourenço, for example, was at the Leaders Summit, very involved, very prominent, I would say. But the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa played more of a secondary role, and we would have liked to see more involvement, because that would democratize almost the African Union's presence at the G20. So South Africa did throughout the year have meetings in Addis. I think there was one in Nigeria, in trying to also involve and consult widely other countries and their needs. And I think this Africa expert panel also was key to get Africa's needs on the table. But it's really work in progress. And I think definitely the African Union can do more. I mean, structurally, it's a bit complicated also, because the Sherpa, the G20 rests on these, every country has got a Sherpa, so the person who represents the country in let's say the G20 or the G7 or whatever. The Sherpa for the African Union is the Commissioner for Economic Affairs, who was only appointed in July. Well, it's quite technical, but her predecessor stepped down in January, etc. So it's been institutionally a bit difficult for the African Union. But apart from the African Union and then Angola, other countries were invited as guests to many of the discussions and working groups. Like you saw the president of Namibia, for example. Deputy President of Nigeria was there. Obviously, the president was invited. There were the Prime Minister of Ethiopia was there, very visible, also participating in many of the side events. So the other African countries were there. They were meaningfully, I think, participating in the discussions. But ultimately, going forward, South Africa is the only African country that is a member state of the G20. And then, as I said, the AU seat next year, Burundi will chair the African Union. So it will have to be the president of Burundi then, going to the US, if all goes according to plan and everybody is still invited to the G20. But yeah, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to come to common positions. But as I said earlier, it's all good and well to have a seat, but what are you actually going to say? Or, what is your position? The African Union doesn't have a foreign policy. African countries don't agree. They do agree on something.
So would it then be fair, Alex, if we say South Africa's presidency of the G20 was a test of Africa's ability to lead, influence, and perhaps shape global conversations?
Yeah, look, South Africa's always been about multilateralism, and so this was a spearhead of multilateralism. It was about inclusiveness as best as South Africa could, and so it did outreach to other African leaders. Obviously, as you heard, Liesl Louw-Vaudran, the chairperson of the AU, president of Angola, was there. President Tinubu was invited, as Liesl mentioned, but he didn't travel to South Africa in the end because of the kidnapping crisis in Nigeria that's taken prominency, and the attention on that and some of the violence in northern Nigeria that the United States has suddenly put pressure on Nigeria over, and so he stayed at home. My view is that the weakest partner in all of this from an African perspective is exactly what Liesl's been highlighting, which is the African Union. It was weak. It wasn't really very visible. The Angolan presidency, so chairperson of the African Union, was much more active and visible than the African Union. And the problem actually is that the African Union, the continental body, has all sorts of structural problems within it. It has good leadership, I think, but being supported has been very difficult for it, including to find common positions. Africa is divided, and a big multilateral forum like G20 has been very challenging for the African Union, not this year just, but we also saw it last year. It was even difficult for the Brazilians to find out who exactly in the African Union Commission was responsible for G20. And there was a dispute in terms of who takes lead on this G20 relationship. And so it's twin-headed, in fact. It's both the chairperson of the African Union, which is on a rotational basis every year. Burundi will be the next one after Angola. And it's also the head, the leader of the African Union Commission. So it's complicated politics here. And the African Union, I think, shows the challenges.
It is complicated, and it seems to get even more so as the day goes by. Liesl, talk to us a bit more about the recognition of African Union as a permanent member of the G20. What new leverage, if any, does that give Africa?
It should give it much more leverage, So it was during the Indian presidency that the African Union was accepted in 2023. Then its first summit was actually in Brazil last year. That really, was also a bit tricky. And then this year, the expectation was that the African Union could fully take up its seat and represent the continent. So really what needs to happen going forward is that within the Secretariat in Addis Ababa, there has to be a permanent structure, or at least a kind of a structure between the various departments of the African Union and the chair's office to coordinate internally its representation, and then the membership, the ambassadors in Addis Ababa, also the permanent representatives committees should start already now preparing, consulting, and making sure that, they know what to do. But that's quite, on a technical level, I think we will finally, get our act together, because there's also the African Development Bank, there's the UNECA, the UN Economic Commission for Africa. There are many structures that can actually do that and draw up, proposals in terms of debt issues and so on. The difficult thing for the African continent is competition amongst member states. I'll give you an example. BRICS enlarged last year to have more members, and Egypt and Ethiopia is now a member. And so for the last couple of years, BRICS always on its agenda after its summits put the reform of the UN Security Council on the agenda, saying we want these countries all to become permanent members of the UNSC, and then South Africa, because of a founding member. This year, at the ministerial BRICS meeting, Egypt and Ethiopia objected, saying, well, there is no consensus around who should represent the continent on the UN Security Council. And so the whole meeting collapsed and there wasn't a statement. And so there's probably healthy competition, but there is competition amongst member states on the African continent in many ways, which, hampers consensus. Yeah.
Alex, this has been described as a momentum for Africa, however you look at it, successfully hosting this summit of countries on the continent. Would it be a far reach to say that this could spark wider reform in global institutions like the UN Security Council, where Africa still lacks a permanent representation?
Look, there is consensus now, even amongst the P5. They can't do it together, but the permanent five all agree that the Security Council needs to reform and be expanded. The cop-out clauses, then they're like, well, then it's up to Africans to work out who it is, who should take the mantle. And Liesl's just described the problems that emerged out of the BRICS summit on working out, well, which African country and how, and should it be permanent, should it be rotational? There is a formula that was agreed years ago at the continental level, but now countries are posturing to say, no, they themselves maybe should be the permanent country. So obviously Egypt is competing, Ethiopia has aspirations, South Africa has aspirations, Kenya does, Nigeria does, and there are newbies also thinking, well, maybe they should have a shot at the UN Security Council as not just as non-permanent members, but permanent ones. But there is now consensus that the Security Council needs to be reformed, that it reflects the end of the Second World War. It is not fit for purpose. But how to move forward, I think, is because of the politics of countries themselves and their ambitions is the big challenge. And of course, European countries that are on the UN Security Council, like the United Kingdom and France, maybe don't deserve permanent seats any longer on the UN Security Council. They reflect an old world order. But as people say, turkeys don't volunteer for Christmas. And so it'll be about the expansion of the Security Council, not dropping people off. There's no way that France or the United Kingdom will put their hands up and say, well, we've served our time now, we'll become non-permanent members and go through that process.
The turkeys don't volunteer for Christmas. I'm sorry, that was really funny to me. Yes, I would like you to speak on that as well. What the chances are that we will get that permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council?
Look, it's at this point very, very difficult to see any UNSC reform over the short term. This is definitely something that African countries and many others have been talking about for a long time. And as Alex said, the situation is untenable. And there is this recognition and realization that there has to be an inclusion of African countries, but also others, Japan, Mexico, Brazil. I mean, the world is so vastly different than it was in 1945. And so, right, so where we are at the moment is there are many different organizations or options and think tanks and people coming up with ideas of organizations like the Elders, for example, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. People are trying to think through how this can work in practice. Once, over the longer term, there is a possibility of wider membership. I mean, the Biden administration at the 11th hour at the end of last year said, okay, we agree to have 2 permanent seats for Africa without a veto, but that doesn't really mean anything. What we have is 5 countries with a veto power that can block any other decisions. So Africa wants, according to its SONE consensus, two seats with veto power, and many others as well. So there's a lot of thinking, a lot of writing. I heard over the weekend from one Chinese think tank. One of the guys was saying he wrote a piece, I think it was Foreign Policy, to say the 21 members of the G20 should be the UN Security Council. So the AU, the EU, and then the 19 other members. So, well, the permanent members are already there. So Russia, China, the UK, France, the US are in the G20. And so you can make it, enlarge it. So there are many interesting proposals. But for now, no one...
I mean, we have the competition among member states that you mentioned. Alex, I want you to expand on that a little. How is it impeding Africa's movement towards improved global relevance? I mean, in a larger picture, while competition is good, when is it detrimental?
Oh, I mean, the UN Security Council is polarized. It's fractured. It's struggling, and so many decisions on Africa that are made in the Council, both are not representative of necessarily where there are the strategic interests of Africa at a Pan-African level. And African voices are muted. They don't have veto power. They are reliant on non-permanent members. There are ways that Africa is trying to work around this. So you've got the Africa 3 plus the Caribbean now trying to reach common positions to kind of push forward their common agendas. It's worked better last year than it seems to have done this year. And I think that very much depends on which countries are voted onto the UN Security Council. I see that Somalia struggles and is really focused just on its kind of immediate region, for example, when other African countries with stronger bureaucracies and experience are on the council, they can kind of punch through a bit more effectively. So I'm thinking of a Kenya or a Ghana or a South Africa or a Nigeria. So it really depends also on that kind of presence and the experience and the resources that can be put into being on the council. But this is, I think, again, the point I was making a bit earlier on why you get forum shopping and more countries wanting to join the BRICS, more countries wanting to join other multilateral forum. And so you've got African governments looking at different ways of trying to punch through into the international system. So we're in a situation of fragmentation at the moment, I'm afraid to say. And so you have various nodes developing, including of middle powers, that are looking to see if they can form alliances together to kind of push forward reform agenda issues and how to cope with some of the big issues of the day, because the biggest platforms just aren't working effectively.
Are we getting a sense that Africa is moving from being perpetually seen as a beneficiary to partner, Liesl?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think things have really changed from, drastically from a previous era where Africa was aid recipients and going around begging for support. And when it comes to its diplomatic weight, things have really changed. I think even as far back as the creation of the African Union. There's something called NEPA, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, and that was the thinking behind it, to say we are partners, we are not, recipients of aid. Of course, there have been many challenges along the way, but I would say even in the last year or so, we've seen a stronger African voice in the General Assembly of the United Nations. When there were votes around, for example, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, suddenly people saw, wow, there's 54 countries that have voting power within the UN. So I do think things have changed, and as Alex said, different African countries are wanting to have a greater voice, and you even see it in trade negotiations. That it's no longer so easy just to dictate the rules. The European Union has found that out in its negotiations with countries like South Africa, for example. It has to accommodate the country's needs. Still a long way to go in some instances, but there's greater agency of African countries and of African institutions globally than there were before, and a greater recognition of Africa's power and potential influence, I'd say.
Yeah, we're inching, no matter how slowly, towards where we want to be. Mixed bag, that's what it's been described as, lessons and triumphs. What would you say are the lessons other African countries can learn from South Africa's G20 hosting year in terms of diplomacy and agenda setting, Alex?
Well, I think having spine, so not being allowed to be over-bullied by the United States, trying to be consensual and be a bridge between North and South. So you had a lot of Northern solidarity also to the South African presidency. Including about having having a final communiqué, so that was important, I think that's a lesson for future G20 summits. It won't be the one that we see next year, but I think the main takeaway from the G20 summit is the importance of multilateralism. I mean, from an African perspective, most African countries support multilateralism, with maybe the exception of Eritrea, that is very exceptionalistic. But most others embrace multilateralism in one form or another, and so that's important.
Liesl, how should South Africa and the AU build on this momentum? So success of Johannesburg isn't just a one-off.
Definitely, no, they can build on this, lessons even for South Africa in terms of the practical diplomatic skills one needs. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa does have that. People in South Africa blame him a lot for being too slow and, creating commissions every time there's something goes wrong. But he does have that very good skill of dialogue, negotiations, sitting right through the night, getting consensus. I think that hard work of diplomacy, I think, is a good lesson that is learned from this achievement for multilateralism. And the African Union certainly, I think, has also learned that it must up its game now and make sure, just on a practical level, to have enough people, to have enough, to be present throughout all the working groups, to be able to achieve, ultimately something like a consensus document.
Thank you very, very much for being here with us on One Slot. We appreciate the insights you've provided.
Thank you.
And of course, what you've heard today is that the G20 Summit in Johannesburg was more than a diplomatic gathering. It was really a test of Africa's capacity to lead, influence, and shape the global conversation, mixed bag or not. While the declaration may lack the teeth some hoped for, the ability to bring together 19 of the world's most powerful economies with all the maneuvering involved and speak with unity is no small achievement. South Africa may not have changed the rules of the game, but it showed that Africa deserves a seat at the table and can hold it with poise. The challenge now is to turn this visibility into a voice with real power that benefits not just Africa, but a more balanced global order. Those are my thoughts. Thank you for watching. I'm Felicity Ezewike. I'll see you on the next one.